Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about evolution and some of the processes of evolution. This comes from Chapter 11 in your Concepts of Biology book, which is the book with the orange cover. My name is Holly Robinson, and I'll be taking you through the PowerPoint, so here we go. Now, evolution is a process that takes hundreds, thousands, or sometimes millions of years to occur. And when we talk about evolution, we're talking about change. It's the process of change in organisms over time, and it's the process that causes new species or new organisms to come into existence. Evolution causes a change in the genotype, which is the genetic makeup of an organism, and it also causes a change in the outer phenotype, which is the outer appearance of the organism. Evolution causes diversity, which means that organisms will become more different from each other. And the principle that all life has evolved and diversified from a common ancestor is really the foundation for which we understand a lot of other questions in biology. For instance, how we classify organisms, how we understand whether organisms are related to each other more closely or more distantly, and understanding the anatomy of organisms like bones and skin and scales, tissues, things like that. All of those things depend on evolution. Now, to give you an early history, Lamarck was one of the first scientists to propose a theory about evolution, and his theory was called the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And he said that the environment could make an organism use or not use a body part. And he basically said that if an organism used or didn't use a certain body part, such as its wings, let's say, then it would pass that use or non-use of its body part to its offspring. And over that time, that species would change. Now, his ideas were pretty simple, but he was one of the first scientists to talk about evolution and influenced a lot of later scientists. Now, you might have seen this slide in your high school biology textbook. Lamarck's theory could be used in an example like this. Since giraffes had to stretch their necks to get food up in the higher branches of the trees, then their necks over 4 generations would become longer. And we know now that it takes more than 4 generations of giraffes to cause such a big change in their neck length. But to Lamarck's credit, they didn't know anything about DNA, and scientific thinking was kind of primitive back then because it was based a lot on only what people could see. Now, Charles Lyell said that the greater age of the earth gave more time for the gradual change in a species. Now, Lyell's idea contrasted with the predominant view of the time, which was that our planet's geology was a consequence of these catastrophic events that occurred during a pretty short past. So Charles Lyell was essentially saying that the Earth was a whole lot older than what a lot of scientists thought during that time period. Now, the two big evolutionists that really got things moving in evolutionary science were Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. And what they did was they went on trips separately, and they were naturalists and field scientists, and they collected lots and lots of plants and animal samples. Now, Darwin went to South America and the Galapagos Islands, which are off the coast of Ecuador, and then Wallace went to Brazil and the Malay Archipelago, and that makes up the largest group of islands in the world. And the Malay Archipelago is really the 17,000 islands in Indonesia and the 7,000 islands in the Philippines. So it's really Southeast Asia. And both of these men collected lots of samples and then wrote up their observations and presented them in 1858. Now, on the Galapagos Islands, Darwin observed species that had some distinct characteristics that were different. For instance, he liked to watch finches, which are these little birds. Okay, there's a picture right on this slide. And he believed that the beak of an ancestral species of finch had adapted over time to equip these birds to be able to eat different foods. So if you look here at bird number 1 on the screen, this is probably a meat-eating bird. It was probably able to tear flesh and be able to chew up really tough tissue that came from other animals. And then bird number 4 down in the bottom right corner, that's probably more of a nectar drinking bird. That bird probably was not a meat eater. And basically they had adapted different beak lengths and sizes based on what their ancestors had eaten over a long period of time. Now, both Wallace and Darwin conceived independently, even though they were on different trips, they conceived natural selection. Okay, they thought this up and they figured out that natural selection could explain how and why evolution has taken place over time. So the 3 main principles of natural selection are, number 1, characteristics of organisms are inherited or they're passed down from parent to offspring or parent to children, and we know that now to be true. Number 2, more offspring are produced than able to survive, and the resources for survival and reproduction are limited. Okay. Now, this really applies to animals that are lower on the food chain than, say, humans. Lower animals like snakes, frogs, they tend to lay lots and lots of eggs. And the reason they lay lots of eggs is that many of those eggs will not survive. Sometimes they will get eaten by predators. Sometimes the offspring will starve because there's not enough food. Sometimes the weather or pollution will kill some of these eggs off, or some of the very small offspring. If it's really, really cold or it's really, really hot, a lot of the offspring are going to die, and they won't be able to reproduce, of course, later on. And then number 3, offspring vary among each other in regard to characteristics, and those variations are inherited. And we know that now to be true. If you have brothers and sisters, you know that you're not exactly alike as them unless you're an identical twin. And so you may have your dad's nose and your mom's eyes, whereas you have a brother or a sister that has your dad's ears and your mom's height or something like that. So variations are inherited. Now, Darwin and Wallace, they said that offspring with inherited characteristics that allow them to compete for limited resources like food and shelter, they'll survive and have more offspring than those individuals with variations that are less competitive. This is basically saying that natural selection is like the survival of the fittest, or the strong survive, or if you've seen the movie The Hunger Games or read the book The Hunger Games, it's a lot like that. If you are able to run faster or swim farther, then you're going to be able to survive and live longer and have more offspring than the individuals that in the animal kingdom, let's say, that can't run as fast or can't swim as far, things like that. The example that they like to give in science books, that's the English peppered moth. Okay, you don't have to know the scientific name, but it's good to know the story. In the pre-1800s in England, the light forms of the peppered moth were predominant and the dark ones were rare. And the reason was because on the trees there were lichens that were very pale, and so the light peppered moth was able to camouflage itself on the trees, whereas the dark peppered moth tended to get eaten a lot more. So the light peppered moth was much more abundant than the dark peppered moth. Well, over time, due to industrialization in England and factories being built and lots more pollution, black soot started to cover the pale lichens. And so the black peppered moth or the dark peppered moth started to thrive, and its numbers went way up because it was able to camouflage itself on the trees, whereas the light peppered moth started to get eaten a lot more and its numbers went way down. Well, in the 1950s, after the Industrial Revolution, the dark forms started to be much more prevalent in industrial areas that had a lot more pollution. And then the pale forms, you found them a lot more on the countryside, okay, out where there wasn't as much pollution and there wasn't as much industrialization. Now, in 1859, Darwin's famous book on the origin of species was published, and he wrote about natural selection in his work. And then he also wrote that species weren't created in their present form, but they evolved from ancestral species. And besides natural selection, he had some big points that were pretty important. Number one, a population has variations such as height, eye color, intelligence, just some traits that are different within a population. And number two, some variations tend to be favorable, or they make it easier for certain individuals to be able to survive and then have more offspring over time. And number three, more offspring are produced than able to survive. And we see that a lot in the animal kingdom, particularly animals that are lower on the food chain. Okay, a lot of those offspring just don't tend to live to adulthood. Number four, those that do survive, they have favorable traits, okay, that make them slightly stronger and able to produce more offspring. And number five, a population will change and evolve over time. Now, natural selection, it can only take place if there's variation or differences among individuals in a population or a species. Okay. So variation, that's just differences in traits among individuals in a population or a species. And genetic diversity in a population or differences, that comes from two main sources, and that's mutation and sexual reproduction. And mutations can cause reduced fitness or reduced health, better fitness or better health, or they don't make any changes at all. Mutations are not always bad. Sometimes they don't really cause any big changes, and then sometimes they are, detrimental to an organism. Okay. Sometimes they can cause diseases, things like that. And then sexual reproduction and crossing over in meiosis, that causes new combinations of genotypes or genes, and ultimately the outer appearance will be different. Okay, you don't have to know details about meiosis, but just know that sexual reproduction and that crossing over step in meiosis causes the genes to combine in different ways. Now, a population, that's classified as all individuals within a species that live in a certain area. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And a species, that's a group of population whose individuals have the potential to interbreed and produce viable offspring, or offspring that can live to adulthood. Okay. Now, if two different species or subspecies are close enough genetically, then they can interbreed also. And one example is you can have a male lion and a female tiger to make a liger, or you can have a female lion and a male tiger to make a tigon. Okay, they're close enough genetically to where they can interbreed. Now, you can also have like a horse and a donkey interbreed, and that will make a mule. The thing with when you cross two different species or subspecies, a lot of the time their offspring is sterile. So a mule cannot interbreed with another mule or another donkey or horse. They just can't have offspring. So that is one of the detrimental things if you breed two different species. Now, an adaptation is just a trait that helps an organism be able to survive and reproduce in its present environment. An adaptation comes about when there's a change in genetic variation that occurs over time that increases or maintains the match of the population with its environment. Okay. And the example given here, that's just the variation in the finch beaks, and that helps them be able to eat certain foods that are available to them. Okay, and the finch beaks were different on the different Galapagos Islands, okay, that Darwin observed. Now to look at these pictures here, bears have an adaptation. They are the only large animals that hibernate, and so instead of having to look for large amounts of food during the winter to be able to get enough calories, bears are just able to kind of shut their metabolic system down, and they go to sleep, and they're very inactive during the winter, which helps them be able to survive the winter and not have to wander around and look for food. Okay. And then the eastern long-necked turtle has an exceptionally long neck that helps it be able to probably see predators better, and also probably just helps it see predators better, and also helps it grab food better. Now, convergent evolution. Convergent evolution, that's what happens when you get similar structures that happen to be in different species. Okay. So basically you have two different species, but they have similar structures. Okay. So if you look here, an ostrich and an emu, these are different species, but they have similar curved backs, similar long necks. They don't fly, but they're different species. Okay. And a lot of that is probably a similarity in habitat and similarity in how they move. Okay. Same thing with the sidewinder and the horned viper. They have similar head shapes, and they move similarly, kind of in that S-shaped motion. And a lot of that has to do with just how they move. And, they're both poisonous. Okay. And how they get food, things like that. Again, sidewinder and horned vipers are different species, but they do have similar structures. And these are just some examples of convergent evolution. Now, divergent evolution, that's when you have two species that evolve in different directions from a common point. Now, they have similar anatomies, but they can look very, very different. And so the example here are like flowers. You can have, flowers have really originated from a common point, okay, some common ancestral plants, but they look very, very different, okay, as you can see right here. Now, analogous structures. Analogous structures on different animals per se, they don't share a common ancestor, but they're similar in function and appearance. Okay, the classic example is the wings of bats and insects. Okay, bat is a mammal, and insect is an arthropod. Okay, and they're all in the animal kingdom, but they're very, very different. Okay, they don't typically share a common ancestor per se. Okay, they're not that similar, okay, as far as being classified. Now, homologous structures, they have a common ancestor. Okay, they're much more closely related. Okay, homologous structures, that would be like the legs of dogs and wolves. They're very close in taxonomy. And then the arms of cats and horses. Cats and horses, believe it or not, are both mammals, and they have a similar ancestor. Homologous structures, you have a common ancestor. Analogous structures, you do not. Okay, analogous structures just means that these animals move the same way and have similar appearances. Now, population genetics. Okay, population genetics is just what it says. Okay, it's just the science of genetic change in a population. Okay, it's pretty obvious. And it's the study of how selective forces change allele frequencies of a population over time. Now, allele frequencies just mean that there are lots of variations in a population. And an allele, in case you don't know, Those are gene variants that arise by mutation and exist at the same relative locations on homologous chromosomes. Okay, if you can remember the X chromosomes, okay, these alleles are on the same places on the different legs of the X. That makes sense. Okay. Now, allele populations can change through natural selection. Okay. If you have a given allele that makes a phenotype or outer appearance that allows an individual to have more offspring that survive and reproduce, then that allele is going to be in greater frequency in the next generation. Okay. And these highly beneficial alleles can become what's called fixed. And when they're fixed, that means that every individual of a population will carry that allele. Okay. And alleles that are detrimental or not helpful, they can be eliminated from the gene pool. And it's good to know a gene pool is just the sum of all alleles in a population. Okay, so keep that in mind. Oops. Okay, Hardy-Weinberg. In lab, we'll be looking at this a little more kind of quantitative or mathematically, but just for lecture, you just need to know kind of what it means, just definition-wise. And Hardy-Weinberg principle just states that a population's allele and genotype frequencies are going to be permanently stable. Okay. Now, unless you have some big evolutionary force that acts on the population, the population's going to carry the same alleles in the same proportions one generation after another. Okay, so individuals would essentially look the same, and it would not matter if the alleles were dominant or recessive. Okay, Hardy-Weinberg principle just says that the population would carry the same alleles in one generation after another. Now, if all 5 of these conditions are met, then Hardy-Weinberg principle will be maintained and you'll have a population at equilibrium. You have to have a very large population. You've got to have isolation from other populations. Okay, you can't have them breeding with another community in another place. You can't have any net mutations. You have to have random mating, and there can be no natural selection for Hardy-Weinberg principle to work. Okay, it's good to know those 5. Okay. Now, on the flip side, the big 5 forces that will disrupt equilibrium and bring about evolution over time. Number 1 is genetic drift, okay, which is just the change in a gene pool of a small population due to just random chance. Okay. You can have migration. Okay, migration, or when animals move around, okay, then that will disrupt equilibrium and bring about evolution. If you have mutation, mutation's going to create one allele out of another one, and it changes an allele's frequency, by a small but continuous amount in each generation. That will push evolution also. Non-random mating. With non-random mating, individuals are going to be more likely to mate with like individuals rather than at random. Okay, so they'll be likely to mate with like individuals or unlike, really, rather than at random. Okay. And then natural selection, we all know that natural selection will definitely push evolution. Now, micro and macro evolution, these are really easy terms to remember. Microevolution, that's just a change in a population's gene pool over a succession of generations. It's just gradual change in species over time. Okay, it's just at a small level. Whereas macroevolution, that's broader scale, big level changes in evolution, and that gives rise to new species and different taxonomic groups that have widely different characteristics. Okay. Now, some mechanisms of microevolution. Number 1 is genetic drift. This is a good term to know. Okay. And genetic drift is most important in small populations. It's just the change in the gene pool of a small population due to chance. Okay, and there's two big examples of genetic drift. You can have a bottleneck effect or a founder effect. Okay, so let's look at those a little more closely. Now, a bottleneck effect, okay, that's just genetic drift that results from a disaster that drastically reduces the population size. Okay, and if you think about a bottle and how it gets smaller up towards the top, okay, that's like the bottleneck effect. Okay, it basically results in a large portion of the genome suddenly being wiped out. Okay, and a lot of this has to do with like a natural disaster like earthquakes, volcano eruptions, a tsunami, a hurricane, a drought, a famine. Anything like that can cause a bottleneck effect. Okay, and that will just reduce the number of alleles basically because a whole lot of organisms have died. Okay, it's usually due to a natural disaster. And then a founder effect. Founder effect, that is just genetic drift that results from colonization of a new location by a small number of individuals, or if a population gets divided by a physical barrier of some kind. Okay. So I always think about the founding fathers and they colonized the new world, like the pilgrims. Okay. That's a founder effect. Okay. Basically, if you get a small number of organisms that move to a new place, or if they're physically barricaded in an area, like if they're on an island per se, that's going to be a founder effect. And so you get random change of the gene pool. Examples that they have are like the islands. They found that the finches that Darwin looked at, they really couldn't find, scientists later that is, couldn't find those finches anywhere else in the world. A classic example, the lemurs in Madagascar. There's about 100 different types of lemurs. You really can't find that many lemurs and that many different lemurs really anywhere else in the world. So it's really kind of a founder effect. Now, number two, migration. Basically, you can get a gain or loss of alleles from a population by the movement of individuals or gametes. Classic example of seeds. Seeds will spread far and wide, and so you'll lose some alleles, you'll gain some. Okay, if other seeds get mixed in or so forth. Immigration or things like that. If you get a group of people that move to a new area and they bring with them, let's say, a genetic disorder, something like that, then they will kind of infiltrate that genetic disorder, into the population. Okay, one example would be the Afrikaner population of, let's say, Dutch settlers that moved to South Africa. Okay, they brought with them a higher incidence of Huntington's disease, which is a terrible autosomal dominant disease. It's a neurological disorder that's fatal. Okay, it causes terrible dementia. The Afrikaner population of these Dutch settlers that went to South Africa also brought with them Fanconi's anemia, which causes bone marrow problems and congenital abnormalities, bad things like that. So sometimes a population will bring with them, some traits, and they'll actually infiltrate that into the population that's already there. Now, mutation. Mutation, that's just the change in an organism's DNA that creates a new allele. It can be beneficial or harmful. For instance, it can improve resilience. Like E. coli over time has adapted itself due to mutation to be able to withstand higher ranges of temperature and then lower ranges also, things like that. Mutation can also cause terrible things like cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, Huntington's disease, Tay-Sachs disease. It can also cause things that are not quite as difficult, okay, for an organism to be able to survive, like color blindness. That's considered to be a mutation. And then non-random mating. Okay, non-random mating is just a selection of mates other than by chance, and that shifts the genotype frequencies, but not allele frequencies. You don't have to know details about that. And then finally, natural selection. Natural selection, that just is going to ensure that stronger traits are basically inherited by future generations. Now, evidence of evolution, the most obvious one that's our fossils. Okay, archaeologists, and paleontologists look for bones. They look for teeth, hard structures in animal remains, particularly. They can't do that as well with plant remains because plants don't have hard structures as much. But anyway, basically the fossils in the order in which they appear in layers of sedimentary rock show evolution over time. If you look at these horses right here, horses millions of years ago looked like kind of big dogs, and they basically got bigger, and humans bred them to be taller and have longer legs, and so they have evolved over time to become what the horses that we know of today. And then second up, another evidence of evolution, we can look at anatomy and embryology, of these fossils. Just one definition that's good to know, taxonomy, that's just the classification of life forms. We'll talk about that more in chapter 12. You can look at homologous structures, which are similar and have a common ancestor. If you look in this picture, humans and dogs, for instance, and whales, and also birds, they have what looks like a radius and an ulna and carpal bones, or those wrist bones, and then their fingers are segmented, which are kind of interesting. Well, the bird doesn't have as much segmentation, but the others do. And it kind of shows that there was really a common ancestor for all of these, even though humans, dogs, and whales are actually closer. They would be mammals, and then a bird is actually classified as a reptile, but there was a common ancestor because these bones tend to look similar. And then you have vestigial structures. Scientists can look at those. Those are just unused structures that don't really have any good function. A classic example, the appendix in humans, we don't use it anymore. Okay, it's just an outpouching near our large intestine, and we don't use it because we actually cook a lot of our food. They think it was used to store plant starch in prehistoric humans. Okay. Also, the wings on flightless birds, the sightless eyes of cave mammals, things like that. Those are all vestigial structures. Then, the convergence of form in animals that have common environments, and then also embryology. If you look at embryology here, these tiny little beginnings of the fish, the salamander, the turtle, and the human tend to look very, very similar, and scientists have used that to assert that there is a common ancestor within, all of these organisms. Whether you believe that or not is really up to you. Okay, but they all do kind of look alike, as you can see. Now, some other evidences of evolution that scientists can look at are of course, DNA sequences and proteins. Okay, the relatedness of groups of organisms, that's going to be reflected in the similarity of DNA sequences. And then also biogeography. Biogeography is just the geographical distribution of species, and that's going to stem from the movement of tectonic plates over geographical time. Okay, and if you think about like marsupials in Australia, you find marsupials like the koala bear and even kangaroos and things like that. There aren't a lot of other mammals in Australia, but you can't really find the marsupials many other places besides like New Zealand. Okay, so that's biogeography. It's just the distribution of the species, and it deals with how the continents moved due to the tectonic plates over time. Okay, so like finches on the Galapagos Islands, the lemurs in Madagascar, it just shows the long isolation of continents. So all of those are just some ways that scientists can look for evidence of evolution. Now, speciation. Speciation is just the evolution of two new species from one original species. Okay. So it involves reproductive isolation of different parts of an ancestral species so that they form two distinct species. So the immigrant finch here, it actually speciated itself into two different species, the cactus finch and the ground finch. Okay. And so there's a little film right here. There's a film link that would be good for you to look at a later time. I'll let you look at that though. Now, for speciation to happen, you got to have two new populations that have to be formed from one original population, and they've got to evolve in such a way that it becomes impossible for them to interbreed. Okay, and the way this works are two specific types. You have allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. Now, allopatric, that deals with geographic separation of populations from a parent species and evolution that comes later. Okay, for instance, ground squirrels in the Grand Canyon, there were two species of squirrels that live on either side of the Grand Canyon, and they evolved from one species, but because they were separated, they eventually speciated themselves and became two new species. And then allopatric speciation, that causes genetic drift for two populations, and so they end up being very different. And the differences in these conditions will cause natural selection to favor each group getting these different adaptations. Okay, so they're going to evolve in different directions from a common point. Okay, for instance, the climate may be different, so some animals may grow more fur over time. They may live in a darker climate. Okay, let's say Alaska or way up north near the North Pole, and so their night vision over time may get better than the other species. Predators, they may acquire different spaces in the food chain. Okay, the food chain placement can be different. Their food supply may be different. They may eat different things over time. Their gastrointestinal tracts may process food differently. And then also, they may have different competitors for food and shelter. Their overall habitats may be different. Now, just some terms to know. If you have a few members of a species that move to a new area, that's dispersal. Okay, that's dispersal. So that would be like seeds that are being blown, into different areas, for instance. But if you have a natural situation like these owls that have these different mountain ranges that physically divide these owls, that's vicariance. Okay, so these owls over time are going to have different climates, and they're also going to have different ecosystems. Okay, due to living in different parts. Okay, different parts of the United States and Mexico. Now, we're going to finish up here pretty soon, which is good. And then reproductive barriers, over time, you can have genotypic and phenotypic divergence between populations that will decrease the chance of reproduction. You can have geographical isolation, and then you can also have offspring that will be infertile, okay, or non-viable, which means they won't live very long. And reproductive barriers are any mechanism that impedes two species from producing fertile or viable hybrid offspring, okay, or offspring that doesn't thrive and doesn't live to adulthood. You can have prezygotic barriers, which occur before fertilization, or postzygotic barriers, which occur after fertilization. Now, we're going to go through this pretty quickly. Prezygotic barriers, you can have temporal isolation where breeding occurs at different times. Animals can be in heat at different times, things like that. You can have habitat isolation. They can just be far apart from each other and live in different habitats. Okay. Or you can have behavioral isolation. You can have little or no sexual attraction, and they can also not be sensitive to each other's pheromones, things like that. Physiological changes in evolution may interfere with successful fertilization. Okay. Now, you can also have physiological changes that cause mechanical isolation. Okay, you can have structural differences that prevent gamete exchange, or you can also have gametes that die, okay, or gametes that fail to unite and fertilization just doesn't happen at all. Now, you can also have hybrid incompatibility, okay, for postzygotic barriers. You can have these zygotes that fail to develop or fail to reach sexual maturity, okay, and you can also have sterility, okay. You can have a hybrid that doesn't make functional gametes, or you can also have hybrids that are weak or infertile. Okay. Now, adaptive radiation. Okay. Adaptive radiation is basically speciation in more than two species. So basically, you have one species, and that gives rise to a whole bunch of new species. And an example are the honeycreeper birds. They live in Hawaii. It's just multiple speciation, basically. You've got this one honeycreeper bird that gives rise to a whole bunch of others. Okay, that's adaptive radiation. Now, sympatric speciation, that occurs within a parent species while remaining in one location. Okay, and that results in radical change, and it produces a relatively isolated subpopulation within a parent population, and that's pretty rare. Now, that sounds kind of confusing, but what they do a lot, mostly they do this in plants, okay, and what they do with these plants is basically they will manipulate the chromosome number. They will take two different kinds of wheat and then cross them and double the chromosome number, and that will actually make a different kind of wheat, and that makes bread wheat. And they do that a lot with rice and corn and wheat, of course. It makes more robust plants, plants that are better able to make food, okay, things like that. And most chromosomal abnormalities in animals tend to be real deadly. Okay, so this kind of genetic manipulation takes place most commonly in plants. Okay, polyploid, just so you know, that's an error in meiosis where all the chromosomes move to one cell instead of separating. That's pretty rare in animals. You see that sometimes with flatworms, crustaceans, things like that. But it's mostly done in plants. Now, sympatric speciation. Sympatric speciation can happen with animals if they geographically separate themselves based on competition for food. Okay, and classic example, Lake Victoria in Africa, you had two populations of kitchlid fish that have distinct physical differences in diets. They live in the lake. These kitchlid fish actually one group dove down in the lake to get food and they speciated themselves. Now you've got two different, species of kitchlids. Okay, basically they just geographically separated themselves because there wasn't enough food and they needed to go find food. Okay, so they moved away, basically. And same thing with apple maggots. Okay, basically they moved trees in order to find food. Okay. Now, to finish this up, interpretations of speciation, you can have two theories, which basically the gradualist model means that there were slow changes in species over time. That's one theory. And then the second one was punctuated equilibrium, and that says that there was evolution that occurred in spurts of relatively rapid change. And, whichever one you choose to believe is up to you. All right, that is the end of Chapter 11 notes. Thank you very much.